All right. Well, welcome to Right to Nonviolence Television. We have decided to develop the YouTube television program of Right to Nonviolence. And today we're going to talk about the impending decision of the Administrative Court of Egypt on the legitimacy of the Constituent Assembly. Today is Monday, and the court announced that it would rule tomorrow, Tuesday, and I have with me the director of the Middle East Constitutional Forum at Right to Nonviolence, Tobias Peyerl, and we're going to discuss what to expect, what should be and what should not be done tomorrow by the court. My first sense is that in the constitutional thicket that we're seeing in Egypt, the courts are assuming far too much power than they should. We had criticized in Right to Nonviolence the decision of the Supreme Constitutional Court that considered that the Majlis Sha'b, the lower house of parliament, should be dissolved. Now things have changed to the extent that there is a delicate balance between the president, who's a Muslim Brotherhood representative, and the army, which is there issuing constitutional declarations, the legitimacy of which is hard to find in democratic practice. But also we have a dissolved parliament that before getting dissolved produced the so-called Constituent Assembly. So with this very complicated constitutional dimension, what is the role of the Administrative Court tomorrow with regard to the Constituent Assembly?
Well, first one has to say that in the terms of balance of power, one could already question whether and why an administrative court should actually rule upon the constitutionality of a legislative organ. Normally, what we would think under the precedence of checks and balances is that, of course, an administrative court would rule about executive power rather than legislative power. So that's already the first step.
All right. So on that point, there is comfort in both the constitutional dispositions prevailing in Egypt and constitutional practice as developed with the Supreme Constitutional Court over the past 30 years. And both show that you're right, Tobias, it would be ill-advised for an administrative court to rule on something as fundamentally constitutional as the legitimacy of the Constituent Assembly. So I think we should draw a first conclusion. It is not the role of the Administrative Court to discuss whether the Constituent Assembly is legitimate or not. It should be left to the political process to sort it out. And perhaps you can talk a little bit about the political process as it stands today in Egypt. So what should be done? If we agree that the Administrative Court should rule itself out of this, then what is the best road for democracy in Egypt?
Well, first, I would like to say that, of course, in the moment we don't have really a legislator in the country. I mean, we have a situation where we have a president and SCAF, which both think that they have the executive power over the country, and that's already a very unclear situation and very dangerous also for the future of the country if you have both a military power and an executive power struggling for having the leadership. And then now we have a constitutional addendum which gives legislative power to SCAF, which is also unprecedented.
Right. Let me interrupt you on this. I think we all agree that the sooner SCAF is out of the picture, the better it is for democracy in Egypt. So I must confess that all these constitutional declarations are very dubious about their importance, especially that they tended to be extremely poorly drafted. So there are a lot of holes, and one of the holes is this: when you end up with a military council that is not elected, that legislates, then who is legislating in Egypt that has any form of popular legitimacy. If we agree that we're not going back, and it's clear that we're not going back on the decision of the Supreme Court dissolving Parliament, then who can we think of that would, at least in a transitional period, legislate that is not SCAF? I have, and we've been behind it on this in our work with our Egyptian colleagues and in the press generally. We have advocated that some legislative power be assigned to the Constituent Assembly. And indeed, the most important legislation that Egypt needs is of a constitutional nature because of the mess that they find themselves in. And so temporarily, we could see that the Assembly, as it starts moving, will be able to regulate the constitutional process in a somewhat more transparent way than it's operating now. But it's not the role of the Constituent Assembly to legislate, right? It is supposed to produce the Constitution, so it doesn't want to be issuing a piece of legislation that becomes controversial and becomes at the center of all the debates in Egypt, whereas what is important in Egypt is to get through the process of constitution making, which that assembly should do. So who else is left to do the minimal legislative decree work that would be appropriate for this delicate transitional period? My conclusion, giving it some further thought, it seems to me that there has been and continues to be a major mistake in the process. And that major mistake is the fault of the president not moving ahead with having a cabinet. So he's been now confirmed for perhaps 2 weeks or over, and he has still not been able to come up with, if not the government, at least the prime minister. And we know that it is imperative to have a prime minister who's not from the Muslim Brotherhood, so that the comprehensive forces of the revolution remain there to satisfy as many Egyptians who've made the revolution as possible. So my take on this whole controversy is that it would be attenuated significantly and in the right direction by having the president move more steadily and with far more speeds in designating his government. So one, he's not on his own, so when he says something that doesn't sound again like Pharaoh, like the mistake he did by trying to undo the decision of the Supreme Court. And if that happens, then we know from practice constitutionally is that if you have a comprehensive, varied government, and there's all indication that the SCAF leader would be the Minister of Defense, then you would have a body of 20 to 30 people who cover enough the Egyptian scene that what they decide would have some sort of a force of law that operates in this transition period. So I don't know what you think, but my answer is, rather than allow this continuing debate between courts in a system that is not well regulated, that more focus comes from the president in particular, because he's the one who will have to make the decision to move ahead with the cabinet and give a sense of deadlines. In other words, when do we get the prime minister? He could do it in 24 hours. And when do we have a full cabinet? And it could be that we don't have a prime minister until we have a full cabinet, but he should have a full cabinet within 3, 4, 5 days. Some people won't be pleased, but if he does an effort to have minorities, to have women prominently on it, to have groups from both the more radical Salafi groups in it and the far more liberal groups in it, then the government itself will be so varied and so comprehensive that it will have naturally a lot of legitimacy, and then we can start moving forward and leave the Constituent Assembly to do what it's supposed to do under the watchful eye of very broad government. So,
yeah, I think I can agree, and maybe we can draw there from a little bit of the experience of Tunisia, where the unity government seems to be quite successful in its evolutionary transitional phase to set up legislature and legislative acts for the whole country, rather than for specific groups.
Especially since if we're talking about legislation, I think despite the great separation of powers theory, we know that most legislation in modern democracies are initiated by the government, even if in theory Parliament is there to offer the process for legislation to go through democratically. In reality, there is no legislation that goes through easily without having the full backing of the government at each and every stage of its passage. All right, well, that's our message, I think, from Right to Nonviolence, the Middle East Constitutional Forum tonight. The Supreme Administrative Court should not rule on this tomorrow. The Constituent Assembly should be left to issue occasional frameworks for the constitutional process to go forward. And most importantly, President Morsi should wake up, stop traveling around, get the government going before next week, so that this government can represent as much as possible the forces of the revolution in Egypt and move ahead with governmental business and the legislation appropriate for it. Good night from Beirut. Tobias Peyerl and I, Chibli Mallat, greet you with hoping that the Supreme Court, the Administrative Court, be wise tomorrow. We'll pick it up from there.